Hi guys, welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to talk through the process of creating this ink and watercolour painting. If you'd like to follow along, the reference photo will be linked in the description. So to begin with, I'm going to show you an easy way to copy from your reference photo. You can of course trace, there's nothing wrong with tracing, but if you are learning to draw, you'll learn a lot more from using a method like this. So I started off by drawing a grid over my reference photo. The grid can be any size, but the most important thing is to copy that exact grid onto the paper that you'll be working on. So with a grid on both my reference photo and my paper, I can start with the first square and work out where my line needs to start and finish. So here I'm first counting down the squares and finding out which one I need to start working in. And then I'm gauging the distance between the top of that square and the butterfly's wing. I then do the same to work out where the edge of the wing leaves the square. The final mark I make is the very top corner of the wing. And all you need to do is connect the dots, trying to follow the reference as closely as possible. You want to be taking your time with this, as if your drawing is wrong, the final product will be too. I'll quickly speed through me completing more of the sketch, but all I'm doing is using the square as a guide to where my lines need to go. Taking a square at a time breaks the drawing up into smaller segments, making it a lot easier to copy. I usually start with the general outline and then go in and draw all of the details and patterns. And once you are finished, you should end up with a drawing that is pretty accurate to your reference photo. Next we need to ink the drawing. I leave the grid lines in during this stage, as it will be easier to erase them and the pencil drawing at the same time once we have fully inked it. You can use any pen as long as it's water resistant, otherwise when you come to watercolour over the top, the ink is going to smudge and bleed everywhere. I'm using a Molotow Blackliner here, and if you're wondering what any of the splatters are I'm using, I list them in the description of all my videos. So when inking, I always start with the outline and I only focus on one wing at a time. Ink is obviously permanent, which is why it's so important that the pencil drawing underneath is accurate. I simply follow the pencil drawing, but I'm also looking at the reference photo to determine which areas I need to outline. If there's an area on the reference photo where I don't see black but I want to divide the area, I will use a broken line instead of a solid one. A good example of this would be the top edge of the bottom wings. There isn't a black outline on the reference photo, but I still want to define that edge. After outlining, I start filling in all of the black areas that I can see on my reference. If there's certain places where it's slightly lighter, I still fill them in, as you can go in with the watercolour glaze later and lighten or tint where needed. Then for shading, I use the stippling method just like I did in my last video. The stippling method is basically just creating value with dots. The closer the dots are to one another, the darker the area will be, and the more spread out they are, the lighter the area will be. For these areas, I'm constantly looking back at my reference to make sure the value I'm creating is correct. Quite often needing to slowly transition my dots from being close together and touching to more spread out. I'm going to speed up the rest of the inking process, as this does take a while. It took me around 2 hours to fully ink this, but it's going to be a lot easier to get this detail in with a pen than it will with a paintbrush. These tiny dots would be a real pain to achieve in watercolour. Again, you want to take your time with this process, as you don't want to accidentally fill in an area that doesn't need to be. For a lot of this dotted area, I haven't got any pencil markings to guide me, so I first focus on filling all the black areas around the patterns, which then leaves me with the area I need to shade with stippling. I'm working around the edge first, putting the dots very close together, and then slowly working my way towards the middle with the dots slowly spreading out. This creates a smooth blend from the solid black filled areas to the lighter area in the middle. I'll let you watch me as I ink the rest of this wing, and then I'll talk a little bit about the body of the butterfly. So this butterfly has a very hairy thorax and head with long hairs laying on top of part of the wings. So for these areas I didn't shade with the stippling method, but instead used lines going in the same direction as the fur. The same rule applies though, with the closer the lines being to one another, the darker the area. For the really light areas I just use a few small marks to suggest a furry texture. Once the body was done, I start on the right side, repeating the exact same process that I did on the left. So I'm just going to speed past the rest of this, if only I could draw this faster in real life. Now once you are done, we need to get rid of all that pencil. Just make sure that the ink is fully dry, as you don't want to go through all that effort and then smudge it. Now you could leave it at that with an ink butterfly study, but we're going to add some colour. So with watercolour, to create smooth blends you want to work wet on wet, which means the surface needs to be wet first. So you can take a clean damp brush and apply water to the areas that you want colour. Don't go over the black areas though, as the paint will follow wherever you have water. So I'm using the very tip of my brush to try and keep inside the ink drawing as best I can. I use a number 6 round for the entirety of this painting, as with a good quality brush you can get a very fine tip. Then I start mixing up colour. I mix up quite a lot of it, as I'll be using the same yellow for most of the painting. For this colour I do add some white, as I wouldn't be able to get the same yellow if I were to just lighten it with water. But once you are happy with the colour, you can just drop some of that paint into the already wet areas. Here I had too much from my paintbrush, which created puddles that didn't soak into the paper. But with a clean damp brush you can soak up the excess so that you don't have puddles of water on your page. Then with your other colours you can do the same thing. With it being wet on wet, they should blend together pretty much on their own. I again just focus on this wing and lay down a light base colour where needed. Now here I realised I went a bit too dark too quick, but that can be easily fixed again with a clean damp brush. With the brush you can go over the painted areas and pull up some of that paint. This is called lifting. Hopefully you can see that this is lightening these areas. You want to do this now as it will get harder with the more layers of paint you add, so make sure to keep the light areas unpainted where you can. Then you just build up that colour layer by layer. I use the exact same colour quite a lot of the time, but with each layer that colour will appear darker. You'll also see me dabbing my finger in the paint, and that is to just quickly lift up some excess water where I went in a bit too heavy. As you get closer to adding the details, a wet and dry method is used. This allows for crisper and finer lines, however a clean and damp brush is again very useful for blending them details out slightly if they are too sharp. Do it this way allows for more control, as the wet on wet technique is unpredictable and usually feathers out the colours too much. For the shadows and the creases in the wing, I use a warmer yellow that is slightly darker in value. Here you can see me using a hairdryer, making sure that surface is completely dry before adding any fine details. Then using a clean damp brush to slightly blend out them details. I repeat this process a few times until I'm happy with the result. Once you're done with that wing, you move on to the next and repeat the process all over again. Make sure you're using the same colours as you did on the first wing. This is why I mix up quite a lot of the colour to start with. Here I want to deepen them shadows a little bit more to add more contrast. Then moving on to the bottom wings, I use the exact same colour as I did for the top. And as they are small enough, I do both wings at the same time. For the body I could see more of a green hue, so I used a cool grey to darken that yellow. Again using a hairdryer to make sure that surface is completely dry before adding the really fine hairs. Now if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like or subscribe if you haven't already. These videos take a really long time to create and it would really help out the channel. Once all of the yellow was done, I moved on to the blue patterning. I don't quite get this blue colour correct the first time, so I do glaze over it later on. I'm slowly building up that colour, getting darker with the more layers I add, especially around that bottom edge where it blends into the black. Then for these red spots, I use the wet and wet technique to blend that red into the blue. After drying, I'm able to really deepen that red on the bottom edge. Now this is where I glaze over that blue with a blue that's closer to a purple. The glaze is basically a watered down paint, so it's transparent enough to brush over the top and just slightly alter the colour. And that is it. That's how you paint a swallowtail butterfly.